No one marked his 30th birthday on a calendar. There was no cake, no phone call that mattered, no quiet sense that life was about to turn. The morning arrived like every other morning had for years, gray, indifferent, almost mocking in its normality. He woke up on a thin mattress that sagged in the middle, the springs long past caring about the weight of a grown man who had failed too many times. The room smelled faintly of damp concrete and instant coffee. Outside the narrow window, the city was already moving, already winning without him. He lay there for a few seconds longer than he should have, staring at a crack in the ceiling that looked like a crooked map of nowhere. 30 years old, he thought. 30. The number felt heavier than it should have. At 20, being broke had felt temporary, almost romantic in a foolish way. At 25, it had felt frustrating but fixable. At 30, it felt like a verdict. His phone buzzed on the floor beside the mattress. Not a birthday message, a notification from the bank. He didn't need to open it to know what it said, but he did anyway, as if pain needed confirmation to be real. Balance, $12.47. Pending charges, rent overdue, credit card maxed, late fee scheduled. He laughed once, a short, dry sound that surprised even him. $12.47. Enough to buy a cheap lunch or ride the bus for a few days, not enough to buy dignity. He rolled out of bed, feet hitting the cold floor, and pulled on the same wrinkled shirt he'd worn yesterday. It smelled clean enough. Clean enough had become a theme in his life. He splashed water on his face in the tiny sink and looked at himself in the cracked mirror. The man looking back didn't look lazy. That was the cruelest part. He looked tired, yes. Worn down, definitely. But lazy? No. Lazy men didn't carry this kind of exhaustion in their eyes. He had tried. God, how he had tried. College, dropped out. A small business with a friend, collapsed under debt and bad timing. Sales jobs, warehouse shifts, freelance gigs that paid late or never. Every time he thought he was climbing, something slipped. An investor backed out. A market crashed. A partner disappeared. And slowly, quietly, the people who once said, "You've got potential," stopped saying anything at all. By mid-morning, he was walking, not because he enjoyed it, but because he couldn't afford to waste bus money. The city towers loomed above him, glass and steel monuments to decisions other people had made correctly. Somewhere up there, men and women sat in offices discussing numbers that would change their lives without them even noticing. He wondered what it felt like to make money while sitting down. He stopped in front of a cafe and watched through the window as people ordered drinks that cost more than his remaining balance. Suits, laptops, easy laughter. He didn't hate them. That surprised him. He didn't feel envy so much as distance, like they lived on a different planet governed by different laws. He turned away before the smell of roasted coffee could convince him to do something stupid with his last dollars. The interview was a formality. He knew it the moment the manager glanced at his resume and smiled too politely. Overqualified here, underqualified there. Too many gaps, too many attempts. The questions were standard. The rejection was gentle. "We'll be in touch." He nodded, thanked them, shook a hand that had already forgotten him, and stepped back into the street feeling lighter in the worst possible way, like a man who had nothing left to lose because there was nothing left to take. That afternoon, he did something he hadn't done in years. He walked. Not to anywhere specific, just forward. Street after street, block after block, letting the noise of the city wash over him. Horns, voices, construction, life happening loudly without asking his permission. Somewhere between a boarded-up storefront and a gleaming bank branch, a thought began to form, faint at first, almost dangerous in its clarity. What if the problem wasn't that he kept failing? What if the problem was that he was playing the wrong game? The idea stopped him in his tracks. He stood there, people flowing around him like water around a rock, and felt something shift inside his chest. For years he had chased stability, a job, a paycheck, approval. He had tried to be chosen by companies, by partners, by systems that were designed to discard most people without blinking. Every rejection had felt personal because he had made himself small enough to fit into other people's boxes. He realized, standing there with nothing but his thoughts and $12 to his name, that he had been begging for a seat at tables that were never meant to feed him. That night, back in his apartment, he didn't turn on the TV. He didn't scroll mindlessly until sleep claimed him. He sat on the edge of the mattress with a notebook he'd almost thrown away months earlier, flipping through blank pages that suddenly looked less like emptiness and more like permission. He wrote down every job he'd ever had, every business idea that failed, every moment he felt cheated, angry, or underestimated. The list grew messy and emotional. Words were scratched out, lines written in the margins. It wasn't organized, it wasn't smart, but it was honest. Somewhere after midnight, his hand cramped and he set the pen down. The notebook lay open, filled with evidence of a life that hadn't gone as planned. He stared at it, then at the wall, then back again, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel ashamed of it. He felt curious. He started reading, not inspirational quotes, not overnight success stories. He read about industries, about logistics, about boring businesses no one bragged about at parties. He read about men who didn't invent anything new, but learned how things moved: money, goods, influence. He noticed a pattern that no one had ever explained to him in school. The people who built empires weren't always the smartest or the most talented. They were the ones who positioned themselves between problems and solutions and refused to move. At 3 a.m, he closed the browser and leaned back, eyes burning, heart racing. He still had no money, no contacts, no safety net, but something was different. The panic that usually sat in his chest like a stone had loosened. In its place was a quieter, sharper feeling: focus. The next weeks were brutal. He sold what little he owned that had resale value: old electronics, books, a jacket he loved but couldn't justify keeping. He ate cheap, slept less, and worked harder than he ever had, not for a boss this time, but for information. He talked to people most others ignored: drivers, clerks, warehouse supervisors. He asked questions and listened more than he spoke. Slowly, he began to see cracks in systems everyone assumed were solid. At 30, he was broke in every way that mattered on paper, but mentally, something had begun to compound. He didn't announce his plan because there wasn't one yet, not in a way that sounded impressive. He just started making small, almost invisible moves: a favor here, a connection there, learning how to reduce friction, how to speed things up, how to make himself useful in ways that didn't come with a job title. When he failed now, it didn't sting the same way. Failure had become data. Months passed, then a year. To anyone watching from the outside, his life still looked unimpressive. Same apartment, same cheap clothes, same quiet existence. But under the surface, he was building leverage, knowledge, relationships, reputation. People began to call him, not because he was powerful, but because he was reliable. He solved problems. He didn't complain. He didn't disappear. On his 31st Earth Day, he didn't have a party, but he did have something new: a small check from a deal he helped structure, money earned not by hours worked, but by value created. It wasn't much. Most people would have shrugged at it. He stared at it like it was proof that gravity could be defied. By the time he turned 32, there were more checks. By 33, there were partners. By 35, there were enemies. Quiet ones, the kind that notice you too late and resent you for existing. He never forgot that morning with $12.47. He carried it with him like a scar you don't show but never stop feeling. It reminded him that nothing was guaranteed and everything was negotiable. At 30, he had been invisible. At 35, he was innovatable. And he was just getting started. The first big opportunity didn't arrive like a miracle. It crept in quietly, disguised as a problem no one else wanted. A mid-sized distribution company was bleeding money. Delays, missing inventory, angry clients. The owners were tired, rich enough to be comfortable, scared enough to listen. Someone mentioned his name, almost casually, the way people do when they're out of better options. "There's this guy," they said. "Doesn't talk much, knows how things move." He walked into their office wearing the same inexpensive jacket, carrying no slides, no flashy projections. He asked questions instead, simple ones. Where does it slow down? Who approves this? Why does this wait overnight? The owners answered defensively at first, then with growing uncertainty. By the end of the meeting, the room felt different, not hopeful, exposed. He didn't ask for a salary. That surprised them. He asked for a percentage of whatever he saved them. If he failed, they owed him nothing. If he succeeded, he wanted a cut. They agreed because it sounded cheap. It was the most expensive agreement they would ever sign. The fixes were unglamorous: routing changes, inventory tracking, renegotiated supplier terms. He spent nights in warehouses, mornings on calls, afternoons smoothing egos bruised by change. Within 6 months, losses shrank. Within a year, profits climbed higher than they had in a decade. Checks arrived regularly now, numbers with commas that still felt unreal when he looked at them. That's when he made his first serious mistake. He believed momentum was protection. Flush with confidence and finally some capital, he expanded too fast. New deals, new partners, new markets he understood just enough to be dangerous. He trusted people because they spoke his language of ambition and growth. He ignored small warning signs because everything else had gone right. When the collapse came, it was sudden and brutal. One partner vanished with cash. A regulatory issue froze operations. Credit tightened overnight. The same city that once ignored him now seemed to watch with quiet interest as his name appeared in conversations, followed by raised eyebrows. He went from rising star to cautionary tale in months. At 38, he stood again on the edge of losing everything, not as broke as before, but more exposed. Reputation on the line, relationships strained, sleep elusive. The old panic knocked, familiar and insistent. But this time, he didn't freeze. He cut ruthlessly. Deals that didn't serve leverage were gone. Partners who talked more than they delivered were cut loose. He consolidated, focused, rebuilt trust one outcome at a time. The crisis taught him what the early success had not. Scale without control is just speed toward disaster. By 40, the second climb began. Slower, stronger. He acquired instead of expanding, buying undervalued operations that fit together like gears. Logistics fed manufacturing. Manufacturing fed distribution. Each piece made the others harder to replace. He wasn't building a business anymore. He was building a system. Competitors noticed. Some tried to copy him. Others tried to block him. None fully understood what he was doing until it was too late. His companies didn't dominate by being the biggest. They dominated by being necessary. At 50, reporters would call it an empire. Analysts would call it vertical integration. He would call it survival perfected. But all of that, the power, the influence, the control, traced back to a man at 30, standing still on a crowded street, realizing he'd been playing the wrong game. And the game once learned never forgot him. Power doesn't announce itself with noise. It arrives quietly, disguised as routine, hidden inside meetings that feel ordinary and decisions that seem small. By the time he understood how much leverage he truly held, others had already begun to orbit him without realizing why. At 42, his calendar stopped being something he filled. It became something people requested access to. Government officials wanted opinions framed as favors. Banks called not to evaluate him, but to ask how much he needed. Competitors stopped undercutting his prices and started studying his silence. He learned quickly that the most valuable thing he owned was no longer money or companies, it was predictability. When he committed, outcomes followed. He refined the system with almost obsessive care. Every acquisition was measured not by revenue alone, but by what it removed from his dependency on others. If a supplier had leverage, he absorbed or replaced them. If a distributor controlled access, he became the distributor. Risk wasn't eliminated, it was internalized. Mistakes still happened, but they happened inside walls he controlled. The shift affected him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Friends from earlier years spoke to him differently now, cautious, as if wealth were contagious. New people entered his life already assuming the version of him they needed: mentor, savior, villain. He played none of those roles willingly. He listened, took notes, made decisions later, alone. At 45, he faced a choice that would define the next decade. A global firm offered to buy a controlling stake. The price was obscene, enough money to secure his bloodline for generations. Advisors urged him to take it. The market was peaking, they said. Risk was everywhere. Cash was safety. He asked one question that unsettled the room. Who controls the system after the sale? The answer was polite, rehearsed, unsatisfying. He declined the offer, quietly. The firm leaked rumors about him afterward, questioning his judgment, suggesting arrogance. He didn't respond. Instead, he expanded into the one area they couldn't touch without unraveling their own structures. It wasn't aggressive, it was precise. When the downturn came, as downturns always do, he didn't scramble. He acquired distressed assets at fractions of their value. While others were laying off workers and issuing apologies, he was hiring, stabilizing, absorbing. The empire didn't grow in the boom, it solidified in the collapse. By 48, the numbers were undeniable. He didn't need to attend meetings to influence outcomes. His absence became a variable people accounted for. When he entered a room, conversations shifted not because he demanded attention, but because decisions would follow. And still, he remembered the mattress, the cracked ceiling, the bank notification that had once defined his worth. He never returned to that apartment, but he carried its lessons everywhere. He paid debts early. He avoided excess. He never confused admiration with loyalty. On his 50th birthday, there was no grand celebration, just a small dinner, a handful of people who had seen him before the rise. Someone raised a glass and joked about how far he'd come. He smiled, but inside he corrected the thought. Distance wasn't the metric, control was. At 30, he had been broke. At 50, he didn't just own companies, he controlled flows of goods, of money, of decisions. Empires weren't built on wealth alone, they were built on understanding where power actually lived. And once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. By 51, he had mastered something most people never noticed until it was too late. Money was not power. Influence was not power. The real power was timing and leverage, knowing exactly when to act, and more importantly, when not to act. Others rushed, stumbled, begged, and lost because they chased the wrong metrics. He measured everything in flow, in alignment, in invisible threads that connected him to the outcome before anyone else realized it existed. He could sit quietly for hours, and in that quiet, the world moved the way he needed it to. Every empire leaves a trail, though. Rivals whispered, regulators probed, former allies tested boundaries. He watched carefully. He didn't react to gossip, threats, or arrogance. Instead, he absorbed information like currency, storing it, processing it, using it only when the moment demanded precision. By 52, he had become untouchable, not because he was feared, but because he was indispensable. Decisions that once required committees now required him alone. But the lesson he learned at 30 had never left him. Nothing was permanent. Wealth could be destroyed. Influence could vanish overnight. Empires could crumble like sandcastles in a storm. So he diversified, not just his assets, but his knowledge, his people, his vision. He built redundancy into everything. If one part failed, the rest adapted. If one market collapsed, another absorbed the shock. He was no longer just surviving. He was architecting stability on a scale that few could comprehend. Even as he controlled an empire, he never forgot the man who once had $12.47 in his pocket. That memory sharpened his edge. It reminded him that desperation could teach lessons that comfort never could. It reminded him that fear could be harnessed, that hunger could drive focus, and that failure was the raw material of mastery. He had studied the people who thrived while others floundered, and he had learned to see patterns before they were obvious. At 55, he began mentoring quietly, not for recognition, not for accolades, but because he understood that true legacy wasn't the empire itself, it was the lessons that survived in others, the structures, the habits, the insights that could outlive a single human lifespan. He taught people to observe, to act, to see leverage where others saw chaos, and in doing so, he multiplied the invisible reach of his influence, creating ripple effects that no single transaction could quantify. By the time he reached 60, history had quietly taken note. Economists, journalists, and historians would write about him as a case study, but none would capture the full story. They would focus on the numbers, the acquisitions, the headlines. Few would grasp the quiet discipline, the relentless observation, the refusal to surrender to conventional rules that had made him extraordinary. To the world, he was a billionaire, an empire builder. To himself, he remained the man who once stood in the street at 30, broke, uncertain, but curious enough to see the game no one else understood. And that, in the end, was the secret. Not luck, not talent, not timing, but vision, patience, and the courage to start again when there was nothing left, to transform desperation into strategy, failure into information, and scarcity into leverage. That was how a man broke at 30 could, by 50, control an empire that reshaped the lives of countless people, not through domination, but through insight. He never flaunted it. He didn't need to. The empire's influence was quiet, pervasive, unstoppable, and he knew always that it had begun not with a big idea or a lucky break, but with a simple realization that being broke didn't mean being powerless. Being broke meant the only direction left was forward, and he had the courage to take it. And forward he went, always, unrelenting, unstoppable, unseen, yet everywhere, a force built from nothing, yet shaping everything.